My name is John Miller, and I consider myself a man of faith. In a world seemingly spiraling into chaos and moral decay, my home is my sanctuary, a fortress against the madness beyond my doorstep. I've lived in this quiet suburban neighborhood for over 20 years, finding solace in its predictability and order. I'm not one for gossip, but when the Colemans moved in next door, I couldn't help but take notice. From the very beginning, there was something unsettling about it. At first, I dismissed it as simple prejudice against the unfamiliar. I wanted to believe that. After all, I'm no stranger to the dangers of letting suspicion rule one's mind. But as the days turned into weeks, I could no longer shake the feeling that something was amiss. It started with the noises. At night, when the rest of the neighborhood was silent, their house would come alive with strange sounds. First, it was just a low hum, like the drone of a distant engine. But as the nights went on, the noises grew louder, more distinct. A rhythmic thumping that seemed to resonate through my walls, echoing in my mind long after it had stopped. The sounds weren't just noise. They were a presence, a dark force that crept into my thoughts, unsettling and persistent. I would lie in bed, listening to the sinister symphony that seeped through the walls, my heart pounding in my chest as the minutes stretched into hours. There were times when I thought I heard voices, low and guttural, chanting in a language I couldn't understand. It was as if the house itself was alive, whispering secrets in the dead of night. I tried to dismiss these thoughts as paranoia, the product of an overactive imagination. Deep down, I knew better. I knew there was something strange about the Colemans, something sinister. Their visitors were even more peculiar. They came at all hours, arriving in cars with tinted windows, their faces hidden beneath hats and sunglasses. They slipped into the house quickly, glancing over their shoulders as if they were afraid of being seen. Who were these people? What did they want? I began to watch them more closely, unable to shake the feeling that they were hiding something. I found myself peering out of my window at odd hours, my eyes trained on the house next door. It was always the same, shadows moving behind closed curtains, muffled laughter that turned into cries, faint glow of candlelight flickering in the dark. My mind raced with possibilities, each one more sinister than the last. When I tried to voice my concerns to my other neighbors, they dismissed me with polite indifference, suggesting that I was letting my imagination get the better of me. But I knew what I had heard, what I had seen. Something was happening in that house, something dark. As the days turned into weeks, my curiosity morphed into obsession. I couldn't let it go. I felt it was my duty, my moral obligation, to uncover whatever malevolence lurked next door. I prayed for guidance, asking for the strength to face whatever evil might lie in wait. But the more I prayed, the louder the voices grew, until they filled my mind with a cacophony of dread that I couldn't silence. The turning point came one fateful night, when the noises reached a crescendo. It was unlike anything I had ever heard before. A horrifying mix of screams and chants, punctuated by a loud, rhythmic pounding that shook the very walls of my house. My heart raced with fear and adrenaline, my mind filled with a single thought. I had to know the truth. I had to see what was happening in that house. Driven by a sense of righteous anger and a burning curiosity, I decided to act. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and my faith, I slipped out into the cool night, the shadows of the street stretching out before me like fingers reaching for my soul. As I approached the Colemans' house, a chill ran down my spine. The air seemed thicker, heavier, as if charged with an electric energy that pressed against my skin. The sounds were louder now, almost deafening, drawing me in like a siren's call. The door loomed before me, unlocked and slightly ajar, as if inviting me into the darkness beyond. I took a deep breath, whispered a prayer for protection, and stepped inside, the weight of my decision settling over me like a shroud. What awaited me in that house, I could never have imagined. I had crossed the threshold into a world where shadows danced and darkness whispered, a world where nothing was as it seemed. And in that moment, I knew there was no turning back. I stepped into the Coleman house with trepidation, my heart a relentless drumbeat in my chest. The moment I crossed the threshold, an unnatural chill wrapped around me, settling into my bones like an unwelcome guest. The door creaked shut behind me with an ominous finality, sealing me inside this shadowy realm of secrets. In whispers, I felt like an intruder in a forbidden land. Something beyond curiosity pulled me deeper, urging me forward. Inside, the house was cloaked in shadows, the air thick with an acrid scent I couldn't quite place. My flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing rooms that looked strangely ordinary at first glance, tidy, untouched, as if waiting for an unseen host to arrive. Yet there was an uncanny stillness, a sense of foreboding that hung in the air like a heavy fog. I moved cautiously through the rooms, the silence punctuated only by the creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. The further I ventured, the more I felt the weight of unseen eyes upon me, as if the house itself was aware of my presence. Very walls closing in. Each step felt like a journey deeper into some hidden truth I wasn't prepared to face. As I made my way down a narrow hallway, my flashlight flickered, casting long shadows that danced across the walls like spectral figures. The rhythmic thumping I had heard from my own home was clearer now, resonating from somewhere below, like a heartbeat pulsing through the very foundations of the house. The sound guided me to a door at the end of the hallway, partially open, leading down to what I presumed was the basement. A sense of dread clawed at my insides as I approached, every instinct screaming for me to turn back. But the thought of leaving without answers, without knowing the truth, was unbearable. I hesitated for a moment, standing at the precipice of the unknown. Part of me longed for the comfort of ignorance, the safety of my bed, the illusion of a world untouched by darkness. But another part driven by a relentless need to uncover what lay hidden in the shadows, pushed me forward. I descended the staircase, each step creaking under my weight, echoing like a ghostly whisper in the gloom. As I reached the bottom, the air grew colder, the oppressive darkness thickening around me like a living entity. The rhythmic pounding was louder now, vibrating through the walls, a sinister symphony that reverberated in my very bone. My flashlight illuminated the basement, revealing a space that seemed to defy logic and reason. Strange symbols adorned the walls, painted in a dark, viscous substance that glistened ominously in the dim light. They twisted and turned like serpents, their meanings lost to me, yet undeniably filled with an unsettling power. The artifacts I had glimpsed from above were here, too, macabre relics arranged with disturbing precision. Animal skulls grinned from shelves, their hollow eyes staring into the void. Wax figures stood in rows, their forms twisted and malformed, frozen in grotesque gestures. It was as if I had stumbled into a hidden shrine, dedicated to something ancient and unspeakable. And there, in the center of the room, was the source of the pounding. A group of cloaked figures stood around an altar, chanting in a language that twisted my senses, each syllable a jarring note in a discordant melody. Their voices rose and fell in a hypnotic cadence, weaving a tapestry of sound that ensnared my mind. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the altar, where a single candle flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced like phantoms. The figures remained shrouded in darkness, their faces obscured, but I could feel their gaze upon me, cold and knowing. It was as if they were aware of my presence from the moment I entered, waiting for this very moment. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out the chants that filled the air. Primal fear surged through me, an instinctive urge to flee from this place of darkness and despair. Yet, rooted to the spot, I was powerless to move, trapped in the grip of a nightmare come to life. As I stood frozen, the chanting ceased abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed down on me like a suffocating shroud. The figures turned towards me in unison, their movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring the moment. Though I couldn't see their eyes, I felt their collective gaze pierce through me, stripping away any pretense of bravery I had clung to. One of the cloaked figures stepped forward, breaking the circle, and my heart skipped a beat as I realized they were approaching me. The silence stretched on, tense and unyielding, until finally they spoke. Their voice was calm and measured, yet carried an undeniable authority that resonated through the air. "We've been expecting you, John." The words hung in the air, heavy with an unsettling familiarity. A shiver raced down my spine as if a cold hand had reached out from the shadows to touch my soul. How did they know my name? What did they want from me? "You've watched us for so long, seeking the truth." The figure continued, their voices a chilling blend of understanding and menace. Now you see it for yourself. But be careful, for some truths are best left in the shadows. A low murmur rippled through the group, a sound that resonated with both approval and anticipation. I stood there, caught between fear and curiosity, unable to comprehend the gravity of their words. The urge to flee was overwhelming, yet something held me back, a morbid fascination that kept me rooted in place. I made it back to my house, slamming the door behind me, as if that simple act could somehow lock away the horrors I had just witnessed. But the air inside felt different, charged with an electric tension that seemed to hum through the walls. My sanctuary had been breached, and the familiar comforts of home felt alien and cold. I sank into my chair, my mind a turbulent sea of confusion and dread. What had I stumbled upon in that basement? The symbols, chanting, the cloaked figures who knew my name. None of it made any sense. Yet the fear that gripped me was all too real, a visceral reminder that my world had shifted irrevocably. I tried to rationalize what I had seen, clinging to logic like a lifeline. Perhaps it was some sort of cult, twisted gathering of individuals who thrived on secrecy and deception. Maybe I had imagined it all, my mind playing tricks on me in the oppressive darkness of that basement. But deep down, I knew better. The truth was undeniable, like a shadow lurking just beyond the reach of the light. That night, sleep eluded me, my mind replaying the nightmarish events over and over. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside my window seemed amplified, twisted into sinister whispers that clawed at the edges of my sanity. I lay there, wrapped in the suffocating silence, feeling the weight of the unknown pressing down on me like a tangible force. As dawn finally broke, bringing with it the tentative light of a new day, I felt a strange sense of relief. The morning sun banished the shadows, casting them into retreat, if only temporarily. Yet the events of the previous night lingered like a persistent fog, clouding my thoughts and filling me with unease. In the light of day, I resolved to make sense of what had happened. My first instinct was to confront the Colemans directly, to demand answers and confront them with what I had seen. But the thought of facing those cloaked figures again sent a shiver down my spine. They were not the sort of people you could simply reason with. Their world was one of shadows and secrets, a place where reason had no hold. Instead, I decided to watch them more closely, observing their movements with a newfound intensity. Over the next few days, I noted every visitor, every flicker of light in their windows, every muffled sound that drifted across the night air. I became a shadow myself, lurking in the corners of my home, driven by an obsessive need to uncover their dark purpose. But as I watched, I began to notice something strange, a subtle change in the atmosphere around me. It started with the feeling of being watched, a sensation that crawled beneath my skin and lingered at the edge of my consciousness. I would catch glimpses of movement from the corner of my eye, shadows that seemed to flit just beyond my sight. It was as if the darkness I had encountered in the Coleman house followed me home, seeping into the fabric of my life. At first, I dismissed these occurrences as paranoia, the lingering effects of the fear that had taken root in my mind. But as the days passed, feeling grew stronger, an ever-present shadow that clung to my every step. My house, once a refuge from the world outside, now felt like a cage, its walls closing in around me with each passing moment. Sleep offered no escape, my dreams haunted by visions of the basement and the chanting figures that filled it. I would wake in the dead of night, drenched in sweat, the echoes of their voices ringing in my ears. It was as if they were calling to me, drawing me back into the darkness I had barely escaped. One night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I heard it again. The rhythmic pounding I had come to associate with the Colemans' rituals. But this time, it was coming from within my own house. A haunting echo that seemed to emanate from the very walls. The sound was faint at first, barely discernible above the pounding of my heart. But it grew louder, more insistent, until it filled the room, drowning out all other thoughts. I sat up, the darkness pressing in around me like a suffocating shroud. My flashlight lay on the bedside table, a solitary beacon of light in a world consumed by shadows. I hesitated, fear and curiosity warring within me, before finally reaching for it, determined to confront whatever lay in wait. The beam of light cut through the darkness as I crept through the house, each step slow and deliberate, Pounding continued, a relentless rhythm that seemed to pull me forward, guiding me deeper into the unknown. I followed it down the hallway, past rooms that loomed like silent sentinels, until I reached the basement door. Stood ajar, a gaping maw that beckoned me into its depth. The pounding was louder here, resonating through the floorboards with an intensity that shook the very foundation of my home. I hesitated at the threshold, flashlight trembling in my hand, as I peered into the abyss below. Taking a deep breath, I descended the stairs once more, darkness swallowing me whole as I ventured into the heart of my own fears. The air was cold and stale, tangible reminder of the horrors I had encountered in the Coleman's basement. But this was my house, my domain, and whatever force had invaded it would find no welcome here. As I reached the bottom, the pounding ceased abruptly, leaving behind an eerie silence that was somehow more unsettling. The basement was empty, the shadows still and silent, yet the sense of being watched was stronger than ever. I swept the flashlight across the room, my heart pounding in my chest as I searched for the source of the disturbance. There, in the far corner, something caught my eye. An object half hidden beneath an old tarp, its shape indistinct in the dim light. I approached cautiously, my breath catching in my throat as I reached out to uncover it. The tarp slipped away, revealing a mirror, its surface cracked and clouded with age, yet reflecting a distorted image of the room around me. For a moment, I stared into the glass, my own reflection staring back at me with eyes wide and fearful. But then I saw something else. A flicker of movement in the background. A shadow that shouldn't have been there, shifting and twisting just beyond the edge of the frame. I turned, my heart racing, but the basement was empty. The darkness was impenetrable, hiding whatever presence lurked within its depths. My mind spun with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. Had the darkness followed me home? Or was it something else? Something that had been waiting here all along? The mirror seemed to pulse with an energy of its own, drawing my gaze back to its cracked surface. As I stared, the reflection began to change, the shadows twisting and coalescing into a form I recognized all too well. Cloaked figure from the Coleman's basement, their face still hidden, yet unmistakably aware of my presence. The figure seemed to reach out from the glass, their hand stretching towards me with a deliberate slowness that sent chills racing down my spine. It was as if they were beckoning me to join them, to step through the looking glass into a world where nightmares ruled. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat as I scrambled for the stairs, flashlight swinging wildly in my hand. The figure remained in the mirror, a silent specter that watched with eyes I couldn't see, yet felt with every fiber of my being. I fled the basement, the oppressive weight of unseen eyes pressing down on me with each step. As I slammed the door shut behind me, the pounding resumed, haunting rhythm that seemed to echo in the very walls. It was a warning, a reminder that the darkness I had uncovered would not be easily banished. The Coleman's house had opened a door to a world I couldn't comprehend, and now that darkness had seeped into my life. An unwelcome shadow that refused to let go. I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. Whatever force had taken root in my home, I would have to confront it, to face the truth I had so desperately sought. But as I lay awake in the silence of my room, the echoes of that pounding filling the air, I couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness was watching, waiting for the moment when I would finally understand the depths of what I had uncovered. In my quest for answers, I had crossed a line that should never have been crossed. And now, the shadows were closing in, threatening to consume me whole. The days following the encounter in my basement felt like a waking nightmare. Each moment a twisted dance between reality and the shadowy world that had bled into my life. I tried to carry on as if everything was normal, going through the motions of daily routines that now seemed foreign and distant. But the darkness had taken root, casting long shadows that clung to me like a persistent specter. At work, my mind wandered, replaying the events over and over, each detail etched into my memory with a clarity that bordered on obsession. I found myself fixating on the Coleman house, the images of that basement, and the mirror's reflection that haunted my thoughts. It was as if an invisible thread tied me to that place, pulling me inexorably back to the mystery that lay within its walls. Colleagues noticed my distraction. Their polite inquiries met with vague excuses about insomnia and stress. But the truth was something I couldn't explain, even to myself. Creeping dread that gnawed at the edges of my mind, whispering of things best left unseen. I felt as though I were living on the edge of a precipice, teetering on the brink of an abyss that threatened to swallow me whole. As the days turned into a blur of sleepless nights and anxious hours, I became increasingly aware of the sensation of being watched. It was as if a pair of eyes followed my every move, an unseen presence lurking just out of sight. At first, I attributed it to paranoia, a trick of the mind born from fear. But the feeling grew stronger, an insistent weight that pressed down on me with an almost palpable force. One evening, as I sat in the dimly lit living room, I caught sight of movement outside my window, fleeting shadow that slipped between the trees lining my yard. I froze, my heart skipping a beat as I strained to see through the gathering darkness. But whatever I thought I saw had vanished, leaving behind only the rustle of leaves in the wind. Despite my unease, I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched, as if an unseen figure loomed just beyond the edge of perception. Each night, I would lie awake, the darkness of my room stretching out like a yawning chasm, filled with the echoes of that relentless pounding. I was trapped in a cycle of fear and uncertainty, prisoner within my own home. In the quiet moments, when the shadows seemed to close in around me, I thought back to the cloaked figure in the mirror, their eyes hidden but undeniably aware of my presence. It was as if they had left an indelible mark on my soul. A dark tether bound me to their world, a world where the line between the living and the otherworldly blurred. Desperate for answers, I turned to the only source I could think of, my old friend David, professor of folklore and the occult at a local university. He had always indulged my curiosity about the supernatural, humoring my questions with an enthusiasm that bordered on fascination. If anyone could shed light on the mysteries I faced, it would be him. I arranged to meet David at a local cafe, hoping he could provide some insight into the bizarre occurrences that plagued me. As I recounted the events of the past week, his expression shifted from amusement to a kind of grave curiosity, sent a shiver down my spine. "You said you saw symbols?" David asked, his voice tinged with an undercurrent of concern. He leaned in closer, his gaze fixed on me with an intensity that mirrored my own desperation for understanding. "Yes," I replied, my words tumbling out in a rush. "They were painted on the walls of the basement. I can't explain it, David, but there was something wrong about them, something dark." David nodded slowly, his brow furrowing as he processed the information. "And this mirror," continued, his tone measured. "You saw a figure, cloaked figure that you recognized from the Coleman house?" "Exactly," I said, my voice barely a whisper. It was like they were watching me, waiting for something. David sat back, his eyes clouded with thought. He seemed to weigh his words carefully before speaking, as if navigating the delicate balance between skepticism and belief. "You might be dealing with something more than just a mundane disturbance," he said finally, his voice carrying an edge of caution. "There are certain entities, if you will, that exist in the liminal spaces between our world and the next. They feed on energy, often drawing it from rituals or places steeped in emotion. Sounds like what you've encountered might be one of these entities." His explanation sent a chill through me, the reality of my situation settling in like a lead weight. I had crossed into a realm I barely understood, a place where the shadows held more than just darkness. And now the question that lingered in my mind was not just what these entities wanted, but why they had chosen me. David's gaze softened, his concern evident as he continued. "Whatever you do, John, tread carefully. You've already seen how easily the line between our world and theirs can be blurred. If these entities have taken an interest in you, it might be wise to avoid drawing further attention." His words hung in the air, a sobering reminder of the danger I faced. Yet despite the fear that clung to me like a second skin, I felt a flicker of resolve ignite within. I couldn't continue living in the shadow of fear, trapped by forces I couldn't comprehend. If there was a way to break free, to sever the connection that bound me to the darkness, I had to find it. Armed with David's insights and a renewed sense of purpose, I set my sights on unraveling the mystery that had taken hold of my life. The answers I sought lay within the shadows, hidden among the secrets of the Coleman house and the entities that haunted my every step. I knew the path ahead was fraught with danger, a journey into the unknown where the stakes were nothing less than my own sanity. But I was determined to uncover the truth, to face the darkness that had woven itself into the very fabric of my existence. For now, the night still held its terrors, the shadows whispering of secrets and forgotten knowledge. But I was no longer a passive observer in this unfolding nightmare. I had become a player in a game where the stakes were my very soul. And as I prepared to confront the darkness that lay ahead, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever awaited me in the shadows was watching, waiting for the moment when I would finally uncover the truth that lurked just beyond the edge of reason. Determined to unravel the mystery that had consumed my life, I made a decision that would alter the course of my existence. I would confront the Colemans, demand answers, and face whatever dark secrets lay hidden behind their doors. The mere thought filled me with a mixture of dread and anticipation, a volatile cocktail that fueled my resolve and pushed me toward the brink of confrontation. That night, as the clock ticked inexorably toward midnight, I found myself once again outside the Coleman house. The air was heavy with anticipation, each breath a tangible reminder of the darkness I was about to confront. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the neighborhood that felt like a harbinger of the events to come. I approached the house with trepidation, my footsteps echoing in the silence that enveloped the street. The shadows seemed to close in around me, an oppressive force that whispered of unseen eyes and ancient secrets. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to retreat into the safety of my own home and leave the darkness to its own devices. But I knew I couldn't. Not now, not after everything that had transpired. Reaching the front door, I hesitated for a moment, my hand poised to knock. Part of me hoped that no one would answer, that the house would remain silent and unyielding, allowing me to slip away into the night. But the truth demanded confrontation, and my resolve was unwavering. I knocked, the sound echoing like a death knell in the stillness. The seconds stretched into an eternity, each heartbeat a reminder of the stakes I faced. Then, slowly, the door creaked open, revealing the familiar figure of Mrs. Coleman standing in the doorway. Her expression was one of surprise, but beneath it lay something else, an awareness that sent a shiver down my spine. "John," she said, her voice tinged with a warmth that belied the tension in the air. "What brings you here at this hour?" I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what lay ahead. "I need to know what's going on," I replied, my voice firm despite the fear that coiled within me. "I've seen things I can't explain, and I know you're involved." Her eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of something inscrutable passing across her features. For a moment, I wondered if she would deny everything, if this confrontation would end with nothing more than a polite dismissal. But then she nodded, a silent acknowledgement that the facade was no longer tenable. "Come in," she said, stepping aside to let me enter. Her tone was calm, almost resigned, as if she had been expecting this moment all along. I crossed the threshold, the air inside the house thick with an unsettling energy that seemed to hum just beneath the surface. The shadows loomed larger here, cast by the dim glow of candles that lined the hallway, flickering dance of light and darkness that mirrored the turmoil within me. Mrs. Coleman led me through the house, her footsteps quiet on the wooden floors. The atmosphere was tense, each room we passed filled with an eerie silence that spoke of secrets untold. As we reached the basement door, I felt a chill run down my spine, premonition of the horrors that awaited below. We descended the stairs, the air growing colder with each step. The basement was as I remembered it, the symbols etched into the walls and the altar at the center, both unsettlingly familiar. This time it wasn't empty. Cloaked figures were there, their presence a tangible reminder of the forces at play. The air was thick with tension as the figures turned toward me, their faces obscured by shadows. I felt a visceral pull, as if the very darkness around me sought to draw me in, to envelop me in its embrace. Chanting began, low and rhythmic, a haunting melody that resonated with the symbols etched into the walls. Mrs. Coleman stood beside me, her gaze unwavering as she watched the proceedings unfold. There was a sense of inevitability in her stance, a recognition that the path we were on was one of no return. "You wanted to know the truth, John," she said, her voice a steady anchor in the storm of emotions that swirled around us. "You've already seen more than you should, but perhaps it's time you understood." As she spoke, the chanting grew louder, the words forming a tapestry of sound that seemed to wrap around me like a living entity. The symbols on the walls pulsed with an eerie light, casting strange shadows that danced across the floor. It was as if the very room was alive, responding to the presence of something otherworldly that lay just beyond the veil. Mrs. Coleman gestured toward the altar, her eyes locked on mine with an intensity that spoke of hidden knowledge, ancient secret. "What you see here is a gateway," she continued, her words weaving into the chant like a thread through fabric. "A connection to a realm beyond our own, a place where the shadows hold sway and the boundaries of reality are thin." The realization hit me like a physical blow, culmination of fear and understanding that threatened to unravel the very fabric of my being. This was no mere ritual. It was a convergence of worlds, a meeting of realities that defied explanation. The cloaked figures were more than just participants. They were conduits, bridging the gap between our world and the unknown. "You've been chosen, John," Mrs. Coleman said, her voice carrying the weight of inevitability. "The darkness saw something in you, something that resonates with the forces at play. You are a part of this now, whether you wish it or not." The chanting reached a fevered pitch, the sound a cacophony that reverberated through the room. Figures swayed in unison, their movements a mesmerizing dance that seemed to draw me closer to the altar, closer to the abyss that beckoned beyond. I felt a pull, an undeniable force that tugged at the edges of my consciousness, urging me to step forward, to embrace the darkness that awaited. The room seemed to spin, boundaries of reality shifting, as the chanting enveloped me in its embrace. For a moment, I stood at the precipice, teetering on the brink of the unknown. The world around me faded into shadow, the figures becoming indistinct shapes that danced in the periphery of my vision. I was adrift in a sea of darkness, caught between the familiar and the foreign, the known and the unknowable. But then something within me resisted, a spark of defiance that flared bright against the encroaching shadows. It was the part of me that clung to the light, that refused to be consumed by the darkness that sought to claim me. With a surge of willpower, I tore my gaze from the altar, breaking the hold that the ritual had over me. The chanting faltered, figures pausing in their dance as the room seemed to still, the energy dissipating like smoke in the wind. Mrs. Coleman's eyes met mine, flicker of surprise crossing her features before giving way to understanding. The connection had been severed, the gateway closed, at least for now. But the darkness remained, lurking just beyond the edges of perception, a reminder that the battle was far from over. As I ascended the stairs, leaving the basement and its secrets behind, I felt the weight of my choices settle upon me. The darkness had been confronted. The price was yet to be paid. The shadows had retreated, but they were never truly gone, waiting, watching, for the moment when I would once again be drawn into their embrace. Outside, the night was quiet, the world a stark contrast to the turmoil that raged within. The moon cast a silvery light over the neighborhood, its glow a beacon of normalcy in a world that had become anything but. I stood on the threshold, caught between two worlds, the familiar comforts of home and the haunting call of the unknown. Choice was mine. The path ahead was fraught with uncertainty, a journey into the heart of darkness that promised both revelation and danger. As I turned away from the Coleman house, I knew that the story was far from over. The shadows would return and the darkness would call once more. But I was ready to face whatever lay ahead, to confront the forces that sought to shape my destiny. For in the depths of the night, when the world was still and silent, I had glimpsed the truth that lay beyond the veil. And though the shadows whispered of secrets and forgotten knowledge, I was no longer afraid. I had faced the darkness and lived to tell the tale. And in that moment, I knew that I would never be the same again. Before we dive into the second story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button to support us. This video features over an hour of spine-chilling content curated just for you. I'm thrilled you're here to experience these terrifying tales with us. Your support means everything. Now, let's get into the second story. When I first moved into my apartment in New York, I was eager to dive into city life, but nothing could prepare me for what I was about to experience. My new home was in a typical old building with creaky floors and thick walls that had seen better days. I'd heard the rumors about the place. People whispered about strange happenings and eerie noises, but I didn't think much of it. I was too busy settling in. That's when I met Mrs. Crowley, my neighbor. From the moment I saw her, something felt off. She was an elderly woman with a face etched deeply by time, and her eyes had a way of staring through you as if she was looking at something beyond the physical realm. Her apartment was always cloaked in darkness, even during the day, as if the light itself was afraid to enter. She never left her apartment, at least not that I saw. And whenever I caught a glimpse of her through the peephole in her door, she seemed to be standing perfectly still, just inside, her back turned to the hallway. It was unsettling, but I tried to dismiss it as eccentricities of an old woman. One evening, I came home to find the hallway unusually quiet. The usual buzz of city noise seemed distant, swallowed by an odd stillness. Mrs. Crowley's door was slightly ajar, something that never happened. I stood there for a moment, hesitating. The door was just enough open for me to hear a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from inside her apartment. It was almost like a heartbeat, steady, unsettling. My curiosity got the better of me. I knocked lightly on the door, but there was no response. The tapping continued, growing louder, more insistent. My heart pounded in my chest as I pushed the door open just enough to peek inside. The apartment was bathed in a thick, unnatural darkness, and my eyes barely made out strange symbols etched into the wooden floor. The air was frigid, an icy draft that felt out of place in the sweltering heat of the city. I tried to call out for Mrs. Crowley, but my voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence. The tapping ceased abruptly, replaced by a sense of foreboding that clung to me as I quickly backed away. I shut the door, my hands trembling, and hurried back to my own apartment, but the feeling of unease never left me. The darkness of her apartment wasn't just physical. It seemed to seep into everything around it, and it was only the beginning of what was to come. I tried to put the incident with Mrs. Crowley behind me, convincing myself it was just a product of my overactive imagination. But then, the disturbances started. Tiny, creeping things that seemed too eerie to ignore. It was a few nights later, around 11 p.m., when I returned home after a grueling day at work. I was exhausted and looking forward to collapsing into bed. The city's hum was a distant murmur as I fumbled with my keys, eager to escape the chill of the evening. As I approached my door, something caught my eye. Mrs. Crowley's door was ajar again. My stomach twisted into knots. I hesitated, remembering the faint tapping I had heard before. Against my better judgment, I decided to check on her. Maybe she needed help after all. I approached the door, the dim hallway light casting long, unsettling shadows. The door creaked open with a soft groan. I took a deep breath and peered inside. The apartment was draped in darkness, the kind that seemed almost tangible. The air felt unnaturally cold, sending a shiver down my spine. As my eyes adjusted, I noticed something horrifying. Strange, angular symbols were scratched into the wooden floor, their edges smudged as though they had been hastily carved. The symbols seemed to writhe in the faint light, twisting into grotesque patterns that made my head ache just looking at them. I called out, my voice cracking with unease. "Mrs. Crowley? Are you there?" The only response was the silence, heavy and oppressive. The rhythmic tapping had returned, faint but unmistakable, like a distant heartbeat echoing through the walls. I backed away slowly, my heart racing. The darkness in her apartment seemed to press against the door, as if trying to escape. Tapping grew louder, more insistent, and I could almost feel it reverberating through my bones. I turned and fled down the hallway, the sound of the door slamming shut behind me, echoing in my ears. I was breathless by the time I reached my own apartment, and I slammed the door shut, my mind racing. I couldn't shake the image of those symbols from my mind. They were like a chilling omen, and I had a sinking feeling that something far worse was lurking just beyond that door. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't escape the sensation that I was being watched. Every creak of the building, every whisper of wind seemed to carry an unsettling resonance. Sleep was elusive, and as I stared at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that Mrs. Crowley's apartment held something dark and dangerous, and it was only a matter of time before it reached out to me. The unsettling feeling from the night of the symbols clung to me like a second skin. I couldn't shake the gnawing dread that had settled into my bones. Sleep eluded me, as the days turned into nights of restless tossing and turning. Then it happened. It was around 3 a.m., time when the world outside was in the deepest slumber, and the silence of the night was absolute. I was jolted awake by a series of sharp, insistent knocks on my apartment door. My heart pounded in my chest as I squinted through the darkness, the sound echoing through the walls like a malicious whisper. I stumbled out of bed, my limbs heavy with dread. The knocks continued, growing louder and more urgent, as if someone or something was desperate to get in. I approached the door, my hand trembling as I peered through the peephole, but the hallway outside was empty. There was no one there, just the endless, suffocating silence of the building. I opened the door cautiously, half expecting to find someone standing in the hallway. Instead, I was greeted by nothing but darkness. I looked around, the dim light from the hallway barely penetrating the gloom. The knocking had stopped, but the oppressive silence was even more unnerving. I went back inside, my mind racing. The sound of the knocks seemed to be a lingering echo in my ears. I tried to convince myself it was just a figment of my imagination, a trick of the mind brought on by stress and fatigue. But as the night wore on, the knocking returned, accompanied by a low, mournful wail that seemed to seep through the walls. The sound was so sorrowful and heart-wrenching that it made my skin crawl. It was as if someone was crying out from the depths of despair, their cries reverberating through the building. I tried to ignore it, pulling the blankets over my head. The sound was relentless, a constant reminder of something terrible, lurking just beyond the edge of my reality. By 4 a.m., I was on the verge of panic. The wailing had grown louder, more desperate, and I felt an icy chill enveloping the room. Despite the fact that the windows were tightly shut, it was as if the cold had a presence of its own, filling the room with an unnatural chill that made me shiver uncontrollably. I couldn't take it any longer. I decided to confront whatever was causing the noise. Grabbing a flashlight and my phone, I crept out into the hallway, my heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. The hallway was eerily quiet, but I could still hear the faint wailing coming from Mrs. Crowley's apartment. With shaking hands, I approached her door, which was slightly ajar. The cold draft that emanated from inside seemed to cling to me, as if it was trying to pull me in. I hesitated, but the wailing grew louder, more desperate, urging me to go inside. As I pushed the door open, the darkness within was almost palpable. The air was frigid, biting cold that made my breath come out in visible puffs. The wailing had stopped, replaced by a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight pressing down on me. I shined my flashlight around, my hands shaking. The symbols on the floor from before were gone, but the oppressive darkness remained, wrapping around me like a shroud. In the corner of the room, I saw her. Mrs. Crowley was standing there, her back turned to me. The darkness seemed to cling to her like a second skin. My flashlight flickered as I tried to make out her features, but then she turned around. Her face, twisted into a grotesque, inhuman smile, was illuminated by the weak beam of light. Her eyes were black voids, empty and soulless, as though they had seen something too terrible to comprehend. A scream caught in my throat as I stumbled backward, but the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. I could hear her laughter, a low, chilling sound that echoed through the hallway, sending waves of terror through me. I fled back to my apartment, my heart racing, my mind reeling. As I slammed my door shut and locked it, chilling realization set in. I was not alone, and whatever was haunting Mrs. Crowley's apartment had just made its presence very, very clear. Following morning was a blur of frayed nerves and sleepless dread. I barely managed to get through the day, terror of the previous night clinging to me like a shroud. Memory of Mrs. Crowley's ghastly face haunted me, and every shadow seemed to harbor a lurking menace. As night fell, the anxiety became almost unbearable. I had hoped that the horrors of the previous night were a figment of my imagination. Deep down, I knew better. I couldn't shake the feeling that something malevolent was waiting for me. My apartment felt suffocatingly small, as though the walls were closing in on me. By 11 p.m., I was unable to stay still any longer. The apartment felt colder than usual, the air heavy with a chilling draft that had no obvious source. I knew I had to confront whatever was in Mrs. Crowley's apartment again, if only to put my mind at ease. My flashlight and phone were my only companions as I steeled myself for what was to come. The hallway was eerily silent as I approached Mrs. Crowley's door. The shadows seemed to dance ominously in the dim light of the corridor. Her door, always closed tightly before, was now slightly ajar once more. The cold draft that greeted me felt like icy fingers brushing against my skin. I shivered uncontrollably. I pushed the door open, the familiar creak echoing ominously through the hallway. The room was enveloped in the same oppressive darkness, as if it were a void that devoured any semblance of light. My flashlight cut through the gloom, casting erratic beams that barely penetrated the suffocating blackness. The symbols on the floor were gone, but the air was thick with an almost tangible malevolence. The darkness seemed to move, shifting and coiling in the corners of the room. As I moved further inside, the temperature dropped, and a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. Then I saw her again. Mrs. Crowley stood in the far corner of the room, back turned to me as she had been before. The shadows seemed to cling to her, distorting her form. The wail from the previous night was replaced by a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from the very walls. It was incomprehensible. A string of harsh, dissonant sounds that set my teeth on edge. "Mrs. Crowley?" I called out, my voice trembling. She didn't move. As I took a step closer, the whispering grew louder. Cacophony of distorted voices that seemed to merge into one. It felt like they were trying to communicate, reach out from some unfathomable depth. I shone the flashlight towards her, and as it illuminated her face, I saw that her eyes were no longer just empty voids. They were dark, swirling whirlpools of malevolent energy, reflecting a darkness that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Suddenly, she turned around fully. Her face was twisted in an expression of pure, unrestrained horror. Her mouth moved. The sound that emerged was not human. It was a chorus of agonized wails, a symphony of despair that made my blood run cold. I stumbled backward, my flashlight flickering wildly. The room seemed to close in on me, the darkness pressing down with a palpable weight. My breathing was ragged, and I could feel panic rising like a tidal wave. The walls of the room seemed to pulse with a rhythmic, throbbing darkness, as if the very essence of the place was alive and hungry. In a burst of sheer terror, I turned and fled from the apartment, slamming the door shut behind me. My heart pounded in my chest as I ran down the hallway, every step echoing with the sound of my own fear. As I reached my apartment, I threw the deadbolt and pressed my back against the door, my breaths coming in quick, ragged gasps. The whispers and wails from Mrs. Crowley's apartment continued to echo in my mind, a haunting reminder that whatever was lurking in that darkness was not just a figment of my imagination. It was real, and it was waiting for me. The next morning, I was a shell of my former self. The adrenaline from the night before had long since worn off, leaving me with a bone-deep weariness that no amount of sleep could cure. My nerves were frayed, and the terror of Mrs. Crowley's apartment lingered like a shadow over everything I did. Determined to understand what I was dealing with, I decided to dig into the history of the building and its occupants. I visited the local library and spent hours sifting through old newspapers and records, hoping to find some explanation for the horrors I had witnessed. It wasn't long before I discovered that Mrs. Crowley had lived in the apartment for decades. Her husband had disappeared under mysterious circumstances many years ago, and rumors had swirled about the apartment being haunted ever since. The most unsettling detail was a story from an old tenant who claimed to have seen a figure similar to Mrs. Crowley wandering the halls at night, wailing in despair. I learned that the building itself had a dark past. It was built on the site of a long-abandoned asylum, and stories of unexplained phenomena had plagued the area for years. It was as if the darkness of the past had seeped into the very walls of the building, feeding on the fear and sorrow of those who lived there. Feeling the weight of this knowledge, I returned to my apartment with a heavy heart. I was convinced that whatever was in Mrs. Crowley's apartment wasn't just a restless spirit, something far more malevolent. The thought of what I had witnessed, those black, swirling eyes and the anguished wails, kept me awake at night. That evening, as I tried to settle in, a new wave of dread washed over me. The rhythmic tapping that had haunted me before began again, this time more persistent and rhythmic, like a relentless heartbeat pounding through the walls. It wasn't just coming from Mrs. Crowley's apartment. It seemed to be coming from all around me. I tried to ignore it, but the sounds grew louder and more insistent. The cold draft that had plagued me before returned, wrapping around me like icy fingers. Felt as though the apartment was closing in on me, the walls pressing tighter and tighter. Desperate, I tried to contact the building's management, hoping to get some answers or at least some reassurance. But when I reached out, they were oddly evasive, offering only vague reassurances and insisting there was nothing to worry about. Their reactions only deepened my sense of dread. By the time night fell, I was barely holding it together. I locked myself in my bedroom, every shadow in the apartment seeming to whisper of unseen horrors. The tapping had become a relentless drumbeat echoing through my mind. I could feel the darkness pressing in from every side, an oppressive force that seemed to grow stronger with each passing minute. In the dead of night, as the tapping reached a fever pitch, I heard it, the sound of a door creaking open. My heart leaped into my throat as I realized the noise was coming from my own door. I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously approached, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I opened the door to find nothing there, but the sense of something lurking just out of sight was palpable. The apartment felt colder than ever, and the shadows seemed to twist and writhe in the dim light. It was clear that the darkness from Mrs. Crowley's apartment had not only invaded my space but had settled in for a prolonged stay. I had hoped to find peace after learning the history, but instead, I found myself trapped in a nightmare, with no way to escape the suffocating grip of fear. The haunting presence was now part of my life, constant reminder that some darkness cannot be outrun or explained away. I don't know what lies ahead or if I'll ever find relief from this torment. All I know is that the darkness is watching, waiting, and no matter where I go, it seems to follow. The apartment is no longer just a place I live. It has become a prison of fear, and I am its captive. When I was 12, I lived in Tyler, Texas. Those days seem so far away now, especially since I moved to Dallas and started working as a real estate agent. But there are some memories that never fade, no matter how much time passes. One of those memories is about the neighborhood I grew up in. It was the kind of place where the houses were old, the streets were cracked, and the air always seemed a bit thicker, like it was hiding secrets. There was one house in particular that everyone avoided. It stood at the end of our street, dark and foreboding. Paint was peeling, the windows were grimy, and the yard was overgrown with weeds. It belonged to an old woman, but we never knew her name. To us kids, she was simply the witch. We made up all sorts of stories about her, each more terrifying than the last. They said she practiced dark magic, that she could curse anyone who crossed her path. I never really believed those stories, at least not until that summer day when everything changed. I was always out playing baseball with my friends. It was the one thing that made the oppressive heat bearable. We'd play for hours, lost in the game. That day was no different. We were in the middle of a heated match, and I was up to bat. I swung with all my might, and the ball soared through the air, straight towards the witch's house. We watched in horror as it smashed through one of her windows. For a moment, none of us moved. We just stood there, staring at the broken glass. Fear was palpable. Everyone knew better than to go near her house, but the ball was important to me. It was my dad's old baseball, and I couldn't just leave it there. That's when I made the decision that would haunt me for the rest of my life. The tension in the air was thick as my friends and I stood frozen, staring at the broken window. The witch's house loomed at the end of the street, like a dark specter, daring anyone to approach. My friends started whispering, urging me to forget about the ball. But I couldn't. It wasn't just any ball. It was my dad's, the one he had given me before he left. I knew I had to get it back. Summoning all my courage, I took a deep breath and began to walk towards the house. Each step felt heavier than the last, my heart pounding louder in my ears with every inch I moved closer. The old wooden steps creaked under my weight as I reached the porch. The door was slightly ajar, swinging gently in the warm summer breeze. It seemed like an invitation, but not the kind you'd want to accept. It was around 10 a.m., and I remembered seeing the old woman leave for the supermarket earlier. She always left at the same time and took her time coming back. I glanced back at my friends, their faces pale with fear. I nodded, more to reassure myself than them, and pushed the door open. The house was dark inside, the musty smell that hit me like a wall. I stepped into the dimly lit hallway, my eyes struggling to adjust. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. I felt like I was intruding on something ancient and malevolent. As I made my way to the kitchen, the air grew colder. That's when I saw it. The baseball, lying innocently on the floor amidst shards of glass. Relief washed over me for a moment, but it was quickly replaced by an overwhelming sense of dread. I should have grabbed the ball and run, but something made me stop and look around. The kitchen was filled with candles, their flames flickering eerily. They were arranged in a circle, casting strange shadows on the walls. In the center of the circle were bones, old, yellowed bones. They were arranged in a way that made my stomach turn. It was like something out of a nightmare, something that shouldn't exist in the real world. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. This was wrong, all of it. I needed to get out of there, but my feet felt glued to the spot. I stared at the macabre scene, my mind racing with fear and confusion. What had I stumbled into? Standing in that dark, eerie kitchen, my mind screamed at me to grab the ball and get out, but my body refused to move. Flickering candlelight cast unsettling shadows, and the smell of decay hung in the air. The bones, laid out in that sinister pattern, seemed almost to pulse with an unseen energy. Felt like I had stepped into another world, one where nightmares were real. Just as I summoned the courage to reach for the baseball, I heard a noise that made my blood run cold. The creak of the front door opening echoed through the silent house. My heart leapt into my throat. The old woman was back, and I was trapped in her lair. Panic gripped me as I frantically looked for a place to hide. My eyes darted around the room. There was nowhere to go. I was a deer caught in headlights. The sound of her footsteps grew louder, each step slow and deliberate, as if she knew someone was inside. I quickly ducked behind the kitchen counter, pressing myself flat against the cold tiles. The footsteps stopped, and I held my breath, praying she wouldn't find me. But the old woman wasn't fooled. She entered the kitchen, and I could see her feet shuffling across the floor from my hiding spot. She moved with a grace that belied her age, her movements smooth and almost inhuman. As she approached the counter, I felt my heart pounding so hard I was sure she could hear it. Then, she spoke in a voice that chilled me to the bone. "I know you're here," she whispered, her voice dripping with malice. "Come out, little one. I won't hurt you." Every instinct screamed at me to stay hidden, but I knew it was only a matter of time before she found me. Slowly, I stood up, my legs trembling uncontrollably. Her eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment, I knew the stories were true. She wasn't just an old woman. There was something deeply wrong with her. Something otherworldly. She smiled, cold, predatory smile that didn't reach her eyes. "What are you doing in my house?" she asked, her voice now a deadly calm. I'm sorry," I stammered, trying to find my voice. "I just came to get my ball. I didn't mean to break your window." Her expression didn't change. Her eyes seemed to bore into my soul. "You've seen too much," she said softly. "And now you must never speak of this to anyone. If you do, there will be consequence." I nodded, too terrified to speak. She pointed towards the door, and I didn't need any further prompting. I bolted out of the house, not daring to look back. My friends were still waiting outside, their faces filled with worry and fear. They saw the terror in my eyes, and didn't ask any questions. As we ran back to the safety of our homes, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something truly evil. The image of those bones and her piercing gaze stayed with me. haunting my every step. I had seen something that day that no one was meant to see, and it was a secret I would carry with me forever. Running out of that house felt like escaping from a nightmare. The real horror was only beginning to set in. For days, I couldn't shake the images of what I'd seen. Candles, the bones, and the witch's malevolent eyes. I barely slept, jumping at every sound, every shadow. My friends tried to get me to talk about what happened, but I was too scared to say anything. The witch's warning echoed in my mind, and I knew I couldn't risk it. I tried to avoid her house, taking the long way around the neighborhood whenever I could. But sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of her, watching me from her window with that same chilling smile. It was as if she knew the fear she had planted in me and was savoring it. One night, about a week after the incident, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying that dreadful scene over and over. I thought about the bones, trying to make sense of what they were. Were they animal bones, or something worse? Possibilities were endless and terrifying. Curiosity got the better of me, despite the fear. I needed answers. I decided to do some research, hoping to find something that could explain what I saw. I went to the local library, searching through old books and records about our town's history. There were stories about witches and dark magic, but nothing concrete. Felt like I was chasing shadows. One book, however, stood out. It was a dusty, old tome hidden in the back of the library, filled with tales of witchcraft and ritual. My hands trembled as I flipped through the pages. There, among the faded illustrations and cryptic texts, I found a drawing that looked eerily similar to the scene in the witch's kitchen. It described an ancient ritual involving bones and candles, meant to communicate with spirits or worse, summon them. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Whatever the old woman was doing in that house, it wasn't just superstition or harmless eccentricity. It was something dark, something dangerous. And I had stumbled right into the middle of it. The more I read, the more the fear grew. I couldn't keep this to myself any longer. I had to tell someone, but who would believe me? I was just a kid, and this all sounded like something out of a horror movie, but I knew one thing for sure. I needed to stay away from that house and the woman inside it. Whatever she was involved in, it was beyond my understanding and way too dangerous. The days turned into weeks, and the terror slowly began to fade, but it never disappeared completely. I carried the weight of that secret with me, always looking over my shoulder, always feeling like I was being watched. The witch had let me go, but I knew that as long as she was around, I would never truly be safe. Weeks turned into months, but the fear never left me. Every time I walked past the witch's house, I felt her eyes on me, boring into my back. I avoided that street as much as I could, but Tyler was a small town, and sometimes there was no other choice. My friends tried to put it all behind them, but I couldn't forget. The image of those bones and the witch's haunting gaze was burned into my memory. One evening, I had to pass her house on my way home. It was getting dark, and the shadows were growing longer, making the house look even more sinister. I quickened my pace, hoping to get past it as fast as possible. But then I heard it, a soft, eerie humming coming from inside the house. Curiosity and fear fought within me. Part of me wanted to run, but another part, the part that needed answers, made me stop and listen. The humming grew louder, more insistent, like a siren's call. Before I knew it, I found myself standing at her front gate, peering through the darkness. The door was ajar, just like the last time. My heart pounded in my chest as I took a step closer. I needed to know what she was doing, what those bones were for. Maybe it was foolish, but I couldn't live with the fear and uncertainty any longer. I had to confront her, to make her understand that I was done being afraid. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The house was dark, the only light coming from the kitchen, where the humming was the loudest. I crept down the hallway, my breath catching in my throat with every step. When I reached the kitchen, I saw her standing there, her back to me, surrounded by candles once again. She was chanting softly, her voice a low, rhythmic drone. On the floor in front of her was another arrangement of bones, even more elaborate than before. The air was thick, the smell of burning wax, and something else, something rotten. I felt a chill run down my spine. Gathering all my courage, I stepped forward. "What are you doing?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The old woman turned slowly, her eyes locking onto mine. There was no surprise in her expression, only a cold, calculating look. "You shouldn't be here," she said calmly, her voice as icy as her gaze. "I need to know," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. "What are you doing with those bones? What are you?" She smiled, a slow, sinister smile that sent shivers down my spine. "You're a curious one, aren't you? But some things are better left unknown." I stood my ground, refusing to be intimidated. "I'm not leaving until you tell me." She sighed, almost as if she was disappointed. "Very well, if you insist. But know this, knowledge comes at a price." She began to explain, her voice a hypnotic whisper. She spoke of ancient rituals and dark magic, of spirits and curses. The bones, she said, were the remains of those who had wronged her, their souls trapped in a never-ending cycle of torment. The candles were to summon their spirits, to bind them to her will. The more she spoke, the more terrified I became. This wasn't just a story, it was real, and I was standing in the middle of it. The realization that I was way over my head hit me hard. But I couldn't show fear. I had to stay strong. "You've seen too much," she said finally, her eyes narrowing, "and now you're a part of this." My heart sank. I had hoped for answers, but instead, I had walked right into a trap. I had to get out, to escape before it was too late. But as I turned to leave, she grabbed my arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Remember," she hissed, her face inches from mine, "if you tell anyone about this, the spirits will come for you, and they won't stop until they've taken everything." I wrenched my arm free and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop until I was far away from that house, from her. But her words followed me, haunting me. I knew she meant every word. And now I was more scared than ever. I ran home that night as fast as my legs could carry me, not daring to look back. The witch's house, her chilling words, and the horrific scene in the kitchen, all of it haunted me, refusing to let go. Burst through my front door, gasping for breath, my mind racing with terror. I didn't tell my parents what happened. I couldn't. The witch's warning echoed in my mind. If you tell anyone about this, the spirits will come for you. Days turned into weeks, and the fear gnawed at me. Constant, suffocating presence. I avoided that part of the neighborhood entirely. I couldn't even play baseball anymore. The game that once brought me so much joy now filled me with dread, a reminder of that terrible day. My friends noticed the change in me, but I couldn't explain. How could I? They'd never believe me, and even if they did, what could they do? School started, and I tried to bury myself in my studies, hoping to distract myself from the memories. But it was no use. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the witch's face, heard her sinister voice. Sleep became a rare commodity, my nights filled with restless tossing and turning. I was always on edge, always looking over my shoulder, expecting the spirits to come for me. Years passed, and I grew older. Fear never left me. I moved away from Tyler as soon as I could, hoping that distance would help. I settled in Dallas, started a new life as a real estate agent, and tried to forget. But some memories are too powerful to erase. The witch's warning remained etched in my mind, dark shadow over my new life. Even now, as an adult, I can't escape it. Every time I see an old house or a flickering candle, it all comes rushing back. I've tried to convince myself that it was just a child's overactive imagination, that the witch was just an eccentric old woman, and the bones were nothing more than animal remains. But deep down, I know the truth. What I saw that day was real, and the fear is as strong as ever. I've never told anyone about what happened. The witch's threat was too terrifying to ignore. But sometimes late at night, when the world is quiet and the shadows seem to move, I wonder if the spirits are still out there, waiting for the moment I break my silence. I've built a life for myself here in Dallas. I'm successful, have friends, and try to enjoy the simple pleasures of life. But no matter how hard I try, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. Something dark is lurking just out of sight. The fear is always there, lurking in the back of my mind, a constant reminder of that summer day in Tyler. It's been years since I stepped foot in that neighborhood, but the memory is as vivid as ever. The witch may be gone, the house long abandoned, but her curse lives on. And I know, deep down, that I will never truly be free. The fear has become a part of me, a shadow that I can never outrun. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed these chilling stories as much as I enjoyed bringing them to you. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to the channel and give us a thumbs up to keep the terror coming. Your support means the world to us and helps us bring more spine-tingling content your way. Before you go, don't forget to check out the video playing on the screen. It's packed with more unsettling tales and eerie experiences that you won't want to miss. If you have any frightening stories of your own or suggestions for future content, drop them in the comments below. Stay tuned for more haunting adventures. Until next time, sleep tight. If you can,